My name is Bruno Behrend. I am the director for the Center for School Reform for the Heartland Institute. And the Heartland Institute is a free market think tank out of Chicago that, hold on one second, I'm going to close that door. There, I'm back. Heartland's is out of Chicago. We discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to America's social and economic problems. And I think we'd all agree that education in America is clearly one of our greatest social and economic problems. And so when we talk about free market solutions, one of the things, and if you have to leave early, if you have to go, just remember these 4 words when it comes to restoring principles in our education system and also economic sanity in our education system. 4 words. And from these 4 words, you can base all of your arguments and win all of your arguments against friends, relatives, neighbors who are supporting the existing system. And as we're going to find out, that's what it's really all about. Those 4 words are fund children, not systems. And get used to it. Get happy with it. Enjoy it. And then as you start thinking about those 4 words, any tough question you get from somebody who let's say you're helping somebody on a school board campaign, let's say you're helping a state representative, let's say you're helping a governor try to get elected. When somebody questions you and say, well, what do you mean? What about this? What about that? What about all these other things? Those 4 words, fund children, not systems, or fund children, not bureaucracies, those are a great home base to come back to and then begin to answer their questions. Heartland is there to help you answer those questions. We have a booth downstairs, and one of the things that's down there are many of our 10 principles series, and we have the 10 principles of school reform, which you can hand out, once you read those, you're going to be very, very effective at communicating ideas in education reform. But most importantly, it comes down to child-centered funding. It comes down to being able to say to people that we should be funding the child and not the system. So I'm also going to cover some key concepts that will help you remember some of this stuff. Most of my experience in dealing with education on the ground is in Illinois, which is clearly one of the worst off states in some ways, but as you may find out, it's very good in a couple of other things like homeschooling, which is one of the areas I'll cover. But what it comes down to is this: we cannot reform education. We can't talk about, oh, let's do a little bit of a tweak here or a little reform there. We have to transform education. And we have to transform it from the kind of system that it is to the kind of system that works in our favor. And this is important for economic reasons, and more importantly, it's there for cultural reasons. And this is why transformation is so important. Look at the health care bill. Obamacare, and the bureaucracy that it places upon us and the control that it puts over our healthcare system. Look at the TARP, the Fed, the bailouts, bailing out a company that that forgot how to build cars, cap and trade, all of these things. Look at what's happening in Congress right now. How did all of that happen? How did it happen that entire states like Illinois and California became unreformable citadels of public union power that the most rational citizens couldn't defeat or defend principles? And it happened because of one reason: public education. They took over the system decades ago, and they did it slowly. And next thing you know, you're saying, oh, it's for the children, and oh, we need to do this. Oh, we have a problem over here, and we need to do that. And everybody heard the words "for the children," and they started nodding their heads, and they went ahead and voted yes on it. And they voted them more power. They voted them more clout. And now, over time, they've become this very, very powerful political force, not just teachers' unions, but what I would call an interlocking directorate of private businesses and public associations. Unions obviously form the largest political foundation for it. And they control our education system to the extent that if you drop your child off at your typical American school district, you're literally dropping them off almost on foreign soil. And many of you probably have heard a couple of horror stories about how that happens. And education is how we got here. So I keep on trying to tell people, and maybe you agree, maybe you don't, that if you fix education in America, you will end up fixing a good chunk of our problems. Not necessarily immediately in the near term, but certainly you'll start fixing the problems, and you'll definitely fix America's social and economic problems in the long term. Because every single person in this room agrees that it's a good idea to have an educated populace. We all agree with the idea that Thomas Jefferson talked about, saying that we need to have a public education system. Problem is, we no longer have a system that's there to educate our children. We now have a system that's become an employment agency for a vast quantity of people. And education of our children is basically an afterthought. And this was a 70-year process. And what this process did is it put two things in place. A very, very powerful financial network that has their fangs on the necks of the taxpayers to the tune of over $500 billion a year. And they're using this system to specifically undermine what we consider American values. Now, that might sound like a very tough statement. What do you mean our public education system undermines American values? When I tell some people that, to your typical soccer mom, they almost react very, very negatively. They get angry at me. Let me give you a quote from 1973. There was a childhood international education seminar in Colorado with a gentleman who was connected to the public education institutions at the very top from a standpoint of cultural training. And he's a psychiatrist of all things. And this is what he said at a UN conference or an international conference. Every child in America is entering school at age 5, and he's mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, emphasis added on my part, toward a belief in a supernatural being, toward the sovereignty of the nation as a separate entity. It's up to you as teachers. This is a psychiatrist talking to teachers. It is up to you as teachers to make all of these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. Now, how many of you signed up for your child being turned over to a essentially foreign entity in your town called a school district, and have them being inculcated with the values of being an international child of the future, specifically against the kinds of things that we actually support, the 10 Amendments, in individual freedom, some of us even the 10 Commandments? This is not an accident. Our public schools, from the very beginning, and it was a long process. We started off with a little schoolhouse, and the town fathers got together and they put a little bit of money in the kitty, and they hired a teacher, and they had a small schoolhouse, and you had 10 or 15 people in the room, maybe 5 or if it was a smaller town. And some of them were 10 years old, some of them were 5 years old, and they all learned together in a fairly holistic way. And this morphed into institutionalized education. And then the big cities had their history. And all of a sudden, everybody's got together and said, wait a minute, we need to make a system out of this. We need to systematize it. Which in and of itself, systematizing things isn't necessarily bad. But then they turned around, and once you created a system, the people who control the system control the outcome of that system. And it was a slow process. But immediately following World War I, very, very early in the century, you started seeing the intellectual foundations for what many people would call the Prussian model of education. And America follows that very, very closely. Get these large institutions, centrally managed, centrally dictated to, all with a philosophical theory behind them that we may not necessarily like, and then we drop our kids off at those entities 180 days a year. Here's the next problem: intellectual decay. We've already talked about cultural decay. What about intellectual decay? America spends more. Here's something else to remember when you're debating and talking to people. Here's something else to remember with all your friends, just like you want to say fun children, not systems. You also want to remember this: America spends more than any nation on the planet on education and gets less. Now, we may not be getting less than Botswana or Nigeria or some of those countries, but quite frankly, we're at risk of falling behind some of them. Compared to OECD nations, Organization of Economically, OECD, Organization of Economically Developed Countries. That's it. We pay more, and we're at the bottom of the pack. Countries like Latvia, Poland are beating us in educational outcomes, particularly in math and science. Some people might try and tell you we've seen improvements in test scores in the last few years. No Child Left Behind did have a positive impact on closing the achievement gap. And there were gains made up to the 4th grade. All of those gains disappear by the 8th grade and by high school. And this is the way I put it. You guys all have your own language, you all have your own way of talking to people, but this is the way I put it. You can't have an educated populace if the vast majority of the people don't have a good enough education to understand the world around them. How can you understand simple concepts like reading road signs or knowing, just knowing how the world works so that you can live your life day to day if you're not properly educated? And we're not talking about making rocket scientists out of everybody by the time they're in the 8th grade. We're just talking about what we call functionally literate people. There was a news story the other day. This one was a funny one. A guy, criminal. Occasionally, I'll admit to this guilty pleasure of flipping through the channels and finding one of those goofy real reality shows or true TV shows, and they talk about world's dumbest criminals. And these are people who you see that they're young. They're literally can't communicate more than just I'm angry or this, that, or the other thing. They don't have enough words to express themselves. They don't have enough knowledge to understand the world around them. This guy, he goes and he sees one of these houses with a massive bag over it. I mean, just imagine a house with a bag over it. And all over the house is warning, do not enter, fumigation in progress. Blah, blah, blah. They think they were trying to get rid of some bugs or infestation. He breaks into the house, slits the bag, breaks into the house, thinks, hey, nobody can see in. Almost dies, stumbles out on the lawn, and then people catch him for trying to burglarize a place. He was literally, it took him about an hour to actually regain full consciousness. This guy was too stupid to even read a sign saying, don't break into this house, it's being fumigated. That's an extreme example, but just imagine an entire nation of children who don't know how to do simple math. They can read a billboard, but they can't read an instruction manual on how to put something together. And these are the people we're going to have competing with 1 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians, all of whom are striving for a better education. I mean, sooner or later, we're going to be falling behind some of these nations educationally. So that's the intellectual decay that we're undergoing, and it's very dangerous. I read an article in Newsweek the other day, maybe you saw it. America, for the first time, is beginning to have a decline in creativity. Here was an article that talked about a specific creativity test that they've been giving to kids for decades now. And it basically puts kids in a room, and a psychologist is the person who administers the test, but they give you something. They say, well, here's a pencil. What else can you make of it? Here's a few pieces of paper. Try to do something with it. And they've given it to children at various ages. And since 1990, American creativity has been in decline. And that was our possible one saving grace, our one trump card. The fact is that we might have had a poorly educated population where we spent a lot of money on teachers' unions and rich superintendents and expensive buildings, but at least we were so creative that we would be able to create our way out of it by iPods and really great products. And now we're starting to lose that edge, which I would say is not only a function of our education system, but quite a few other things. And then, lastly, we have financial decay. Illinois is bankrupt. It just had to sell $3 billion of assets out of its teachers' pension fund to pay teachers' pension benefits. And I believe that represented just under 10% of the assets in the fund.